is going to be unique in terms of its topic. We're honored tonight to have with us Buford Johnson, who is a member of the Rosenmeier Board of Directors and has been for a long, long time. And he is a former college professor at Mankato State University, St. John's University, and also an adjunct professor here at Central Lakes College several years ago. He taught classes on the U.S. Constitution and the war in Vietnam. Buford comes with a distinguished background in history and on the Constitution, war and literature, American foreign policy, and more. Buford Johnson spent 3 tours of duty in Vietnam and had a very honorable career in the United States Army and Armed Forces of the United States. I have known Buford Johnson since 1968, when he was a candidate for the Congress of the United States from the old 6th District of Minnesota. At that time, that district went from Crow Wing County way down to Candy, Ojai, and Wilmer, I think.
All the way down to Worthington.
All the way down to Worthington. So it was a big district, and that has changed. But we're pleased to have Buford Johnson here tonight to talk about his perspective on the U.S. Constitution, why the Founding Fathers wrote the document that it did, and why and how it has been so successful to this great nation as we adopt. It was a document created for a small rural agricultural society of 3 million people in 13 colonies, 13 states at the time, and yet it has adapted so well to the revolutionary changes that have taken place in America in the last 240 years since the writing of the Constitution of the United States. And it is adapted so well, and so those of you that have questions are going to be having the opportunity to also, after Buford's address, ask questions on the U.S. Constitution. I want to thank you. This Rosenmeier Forum continues in the tradition on the name of Gordon Rosenmeier, who I neglected to mention at the beginning, was the most powerful, the most influential, and most respected legislator in all of Minnesota history. No legislator, including myself, could hold a candle to Gordon Rosenmeier. He absolutely had the greatest, most positive influence on this state and on this country. And I mention the country only because he was a visionary that was the chief author of the first pollution control agency in the nation in 1967, when he created, in his own words and language, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. 3 years later, Richard Nixon, as President of the United States, read that bill and said, my gosh, we have to do the same thing for the nation. And Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, which was copied after the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. With that, and no further ado, it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you Buford Johnson.
Thank you, Steve. You know, this Constitution is quite a document, but it's not worth the paper it's written on, unless it's written in the hearts and minds of the people. And the biggest problem we have today is we've kind of neglected it in our schools. We're not brought up with it. And I think there's a revival going on, trying to understand what we have and why we have it. If you understand where we came from, the philosophy that brought it, the people that brought it forth, and unless we understand it, we'll never appreciate the fact that we've had the greatest form of government in the last 250 years in the history of man. And if you think you're sitting here and you're insignificant, you've never been in a tent at night with a mosquito. Because it takes every one of you to be a part of this great nation. And where does our story start? You can go back to Cicero, you can go back to Greece, and as far back as you want. We've had republics that existed before. They've all collapsed. But the American people, from the 1700s on, were colonies of Britain, the great British Empire. Something unique about the American people. The colonies consumed more literature on philosophy, on religion, on just plain literature, than all the British Empire combined. I don't know if they had that much time on their hands or what happened. But when you look at the members who did help write the Constitution, most of them were attorneys. Many of them had practiced law in England, highly educated. Several of them multimillionaires from our standards. Some of them were shipbuilders, merchants. But they were all people who had a tremendous background, which really helped us today. You know, you go back, what were they reading? Well, at the time, there was a real revolution going on in religion, religious revival almost. But anybody hear of Rousseau, Jacques Rousseau? When I was in junior high, I guess I had that. But if I can find the right page here. Rousseau was rejecting Hobbes and some of Locke. The early theorists, I'm reading from one of his books, but the early theorists also held that sovereignty was transferred from the people to the rulers as a result of a social contract. They're talking about social contract and the people giving their rights away. But Rousseau is saying the people cannot give their rights away. The people will always be sovereign. That's when you pick up, you know, we'll pick that up with Jefferson, who was a reader of this type of thing. Adam Smith, anybody hear of Adam Smith? Our Constitution is much an economic document as it is a political document, although you may not realize it. The first free trade, after the document was signed by the Constitution was put into effect, we had free trade between the states. We didn't have it before the Constitutional Convention. The states were taxing each other for transporting goods and stuff, causing real problems. But here's something from Adam Smith, who the Wealth of Nations came out in 1776. That's when we had the Declaration of Independence. But he had written a book prior to this, and they were all waiting for him to come out with his second book, which is this one. And he identifies the United States. He says it's not the actual greatness of national wealth, but its continual increase, which occasions a rise in wages of labor. It is not accordingly in the richest country, but the most thriving, or those in which are growing rich the fastest, and the wages of labor are the highest. England certainly, in the present times, is a much richer country than any part of North America. The wages of labor, however, are much higher in North America than any part of England. And he goes on. He's identifying us as a center for commerce. We never think about it. But we became a very wealthy group of colonies. We had merchants in our country before the war broke out, the Revolutionary War. That's the one just before my time. We had merchants that owned over 300 ships. This is another interesting story you never hear about. It has an influence on our Constitution, but it's interesting. We had some Jews living in the United States. We talk about religious freedom. Well, we never really had religious freedom. We had a lot of religious groups that came over here for freedom to practice their religion. But ironically, they didn't like other people practicing theirs. Hasn't changed much. I think it was Maryland, was settled by Catholics, and pretty soon the Protestants outnumbered them, and they ended up with a revolutionary, religious war between each other. But the Jews in America, unfortunately, weren't allowed to vote. And in our colonies, the colonies had a right to vote, because what happened in the colonies, they had a governor appointed by the king or his entourage. And a lot of them never showed up. They just passed it on, and they had lackeys running the head of the colonies. But the colonies had their own legislative body. They voted, and they were truly Britons. They taxed themselves. They made their own laws, and they thought of themselves as Britons. And they really understood common law. And even after the Revolution, you had people like Hamilton, who thought the British system was the greatest political system you could ever have. Then what happened? I don't know if you ever heard of the French-Indian War, but there was a group of Frenchmen. Of course, France controlled Canada at the time, just back in the 1750s. The French were building a fort about where Pittsburgh is today, in the Pennsylvania area. And the local colonies, they didn't have much communication with each other. The colonies communicated with England more than each other, so they were a distinct body. But the colonies each had their own militia. And they needed it, especially with the tremendous increase in population. The population from in the 1750s grew sixfold. Just a big input of immigrants, and they were pushing westward. The French didn't like it, and they worked very closely with the Indians, and so they were killing off a lot of our immigrants. And they built a fort, which is now Pittsburgh, I believe it is. George Washington was a commander of the local militia out of Virginia, and he was sent down to get rid of that French fort. He was whipped. He came back in defeat. The British military had a commander, and they had some military troops in the country. And of course they said, well, this is like we used to say in the active duty, you say about the National Guard, a bunch of wimps, they don't know how to fight a war. That's what they said about Washington's militia. I think it was General Bygon, I think was his name, went down to take care of that French fort. They got whipped again, and the general got killed. But in that battle, George Washington had 3 or 4 horses shot out from under him. His hat had a couple bullet holes. His cape had several bullet holes. And he never got scratched. And allegedly, I don't know how true it is, but allegedly, the Indian chief who was in charge of that battle told us, and he kept telling him to shoot. Washington was second in command. Shoot the commander. They said, we have. And we can't hit him. And they're point blank range. So the chief allegedly said, then the spirits must be protecting him for some cause. Stop shooting at him. How much theory is there? I don't know. How many of you believe in divine providence? I don't know. But years back, it was something they believed in. And if you doubt that, anybody here have a dollar bill on them? Take a dollar bill out. I don't think I have one on me. But you take a look at that dollar bill. It's got a triangle. See that triangle? What's on top of it? What's that? An eye. And what does that represent? What? All-seeing God. And what does it say? It says in Latin, He favors our undertaking. And under that, a realization that we are different, unique, and we're going to have a place in history, and I'll read some quotes later on this. Under that, it says, a new order of the ages. So just to give you a feel for what they were thinking back in those days. There was much more of an awareness of God. That doesn't mean they were good practicing Protestants or Catholics. A lot of them were deists. They believed in God, and they weren't too sure where He played in the picture, but there was some oversight. So that's kind of the beginning of who we are and what we think. Now, when the war ended, it wasn't a big deal in our country. We ended up with pretty good. I shouldn't say our country, in the colonies. France lost Canada. The Indians were on the losing side. And they figured, I'm not going to let that happen again. So now they're going to marry up with the British. But Britain had a problem. I don't know if you realize this, but defense spending in war is expensive. And Britain almost went down the tube financially. They had to raise money. And our colonies were prospering. And we paid little attention. In fact, in the process of all that expansion, we had requested permission to raise a larger standing militia, larger army. At that time, when King George II said, no way. So they stopped us from raising a larger army. But then they started quartering more troops in the States, or in the colonies. And then they started taxing us. Well, in the British law, in the British tradition, I have to have a say in taxation. And we didn't have a say. It was coming from London. Then we had the Stamp Act. I don't know if you ever heard of it or not. It only lasted for about a year. The rebellion against the Stamp Act was pretty extreme. They're not treating us like Brits. And pretty soon the Brits are sending more troops to the United States and quartering them in our houses. What you don't read about in history books, but it got pretty bad because they brought the Hessians in and they didn't want to be here. And this was not a desirable tour for them because they didn't get paid that much. They started quartering them in the houses, and the young maids in the house, the young maidens, were at risk. And there was no recourse, which caused more problems. So the quartering of troops was really harsh on us. Anybody ever hear of the Tea Party? Well, our Revolutionary War, as a war goes, it actually started in Massachusetts, Boston. What made that so bad, guess who the major investors were in that tea that got thrown overboard? Several members of the Parliament in Britain were investors in that tea load. And if you want to irritate somebody, hit them in the pocketbook. They got really upset and really started raising taxes and curtailing our trade. I don't know if you knew that, but we shipped a lot of goods out to to Europe. Did you know that we send shiploads of salt, cod, turpentine? I mean, we had a tremendous export going to England. Of course, they processed things and brought us back the goods. But it was, we were doing quite well. But they came in and kind of cut us off. We end up with the Revolutionary War, not just from Massachusetts, but throughout the colonies. And they acted independently. The big battle started taking place in Massachusetts. You ever hear of Concord, the Battle of Concord? Well, the British were going out to confiscate the militia's ammo facility. So they kept the powder and some of their weapons. They didn't make it. They got harassed all the way out to Concord, from Boston, and all the way back. The British basically lost a regiment from our militia. And our militia were just the farmers taking pot shots from behind trees, a little bit organized. But basically, you wonder about the Second Amendment and our arms, our freedom to bear arms. The war was fought over that to start with. But when all this was taking place, all the colonies were providing their own bills of rights, reorganization, kicked out the governors, elected their own. Some of them were called presidents, some of them were called, there are two different titles for it. But most of them, they called them president, some called them governor. So there's the beginning of the colonies. Each colony became its own nation. Basically, we ended up with 13 independent sovereign nations. And in so doing, we had some problems. We had to coordinate with the battle because of the Revolutionary War. So we had the Continental Congresses developed. The states elected people to develop a Continental Congress. That was the government. In fact, they redid it twice. It was a state legislative, or it was a national legislative body. And they developed some rules and regulations, but they didn't have the power to enforce them. They had the power to tax, but no way to collect. So basically, they were at the whim of the states. And what did they tax? They taxed based on population and wealth. And in the Continental Congress, based on tax and wealth, the question is, how do you tax the southern states because of all the slavery down there? And at this time already, Massachusetts had outlawed slavery, and it wasn't that prevalent in the middle part of the country or north. Basically in the south, we had large plantations. They had labor-intensive requirements for labor. So in the Continental Congress, they came up with, how do you treat slaves? They came up with the 3/5 rule for identification for tax purposes. And that thing slips into our Constitution for tax purposes. But now, I read books from way back when. Every generation has a little different emphasis on the Constitution. And it's interesting because several years ago, when I got books from my grandmother and my dad on the Constitution, the slave issue wasn't a big part of those books on the Constitution. But if I pick up a modern book, they're going to emphasize the slave issue. But stop and think about the Declaration of Independence gives us an ideology, natural law. The Constitution gives us structure on how to run a government. In fact, one of the charges, I think it was Gouverneur Morris was the head of the Committee on Style. When he sat down in the committee, George Washington told him, just do a good job on rewording what we've done so far, but don't input anything from theory, from ideology. What was the other? Another one. Don't use reason, theory, or ideology. Use experience and common sense. And all those people in that constitutional hall had been through holy hell for about 3 months. How many here have ever been to a political convention? Well, they started the convention with Ben Franklin. I'm going to read his statement when they left. They started with Ben Franklin. What kind of government should we have? Stop and think about this. When the delegates started coming in, and not all of them showed up, there were not enough showed up for about 12 days to have a quorum. So Washington came in Philadelphia. They were having a I don't know, I'm not going to call it a church rally, but a big, where the Church of England was getting together for their big shindig. And the Cincinnatians, ever hear of them? Were getting together. Those were the officers of the Revolution. And they call themselves Cincinnatians. Ever hear of Cincinnati? Out of Italy, out of Rome. Cincinnati was a general who retired. They ran into a problem and they needed a new leader, or needed another leader, so they called him back onto active duty. He goes out, wins the battle, and could have become emperor, and says, no, I want to go back to my farm. And he leaves. People don't do that. Usually if they hit the high point, they take advantage of it. Well, George Washington, when he won the war, or after he won the war, said, that's it. I'm going back to my farm, my plantation. Now, what you don't know about George Washington, man was brilliant. He liked to make money. His farm didn't grow tobacco. He had slaves. But he had an experimental farm with his buddy and his mentor was a fellow by the name of George Mason, who was very active at our Constitutional Convention. And George Mason had been an advisor to George Washington for years. And after he left the military, Mason was helping him develop new, not strawberries, but cherry trees. And then Washington grew wheat and had an ongoing operation. It was quite plentiful, did quite well for him. But he was also a prospector in real estate. And a lot of people were, because we had a lot of territory to prospect in. But well educated, highly respected. So going into the convention, you had George Washington, escorted by all his officers who were having that convention in Philadelphia. And they were pleading with him because a lot of them hadn't been paid yet. Pleading with him to take over the country. And he wouldn't have no part of it. Ben Franklin, on the other hand, in Philadelphia, was brought in a carriage, brought in by local prisoners. He was president of Philadelphia at the time. And Ben Franklin liked to put on a show. But he came in. And he's the one that says, makes no difference what kind of government you have. Even when God created it, it didn't work. Well, in the end, I'm going to read his last presentation. He says, hey, we're doing the best we can do. Let's see what we can do with it. But convention starts. Virginia gets up. James Madison wrote out a type of government we should have. And he's been doing a lot of studies on republics. But the governor at that time of Virginia, is the one who gave the presentation. And it was about 67 articles on what it's going to be like. He spent the whole day, to the point of wearing people out, talking too much. But basically, the president was going to be 3 people, not 1. The legislative body was going to be chosen, and they're going to have 2 houses. And the second house is chosen by the legislative body in the first house, and the 2 houses will then elect 2 presidents, have different missions. And then they would have a Supreme Court. But the voting for that legislative body was going to be based upon population. The small states say, well, wait a minute. We don't like this picture. You're going to have all the representation. We'll have minuscule, and you're going to run roughshod over us. So, you're not going to believe this. The first introduction, the Virginia plan, was debated the following day. They had 90 votes on the various issues in that plan. There was a young guy that James Madison didn't like, named Pinckney, who had written out a constitution that he thought would work out with a president, upper house, lower house, the Supreme Court. Pretty well written out. But he never had a chance to present it. Madison didn't like him. Thought he was a young upstart. Never gets mentioned in any of them. Madison kept a lot of good records, but he never says much about this young guy, Pinckney. So what he does, he just shows it to everybody, and he had a copy, so everybody got a copy, but it was never brought up. Then my favorite character, just good old common sense, Roger Sherman. Have you ever heard of him? Connecticut. Self-educated. He was a lawyer, self-educated. Started out as a shoemaker, became a merchant, did fairly well. Just good common sense. No great orator. Whenever he got up with a very short subject, bang, and he hit the subject and sat down. Well, they're going over this big fight about the large states, smaller states. And he solves the problem. We got to have the states represented. Now you have to understand, when they voted in this operation, in this Congress, they voted by state. So if I had 3 members from the state, they would have to have 2 of them agreeing to it, then the state could vote. So there were basically 13 votes for the Constitutional Convention, because they were representing the states. New York sent a delegate down, and they ended up with Hamilton in it. Jay was supposed to come, and the governor of New York, who did not like the idea of a government that was going to be sovereign over the states, said the heck with Jay, and he appointed Hamilton with 2 people he knew that would be supporters of the state. And so Hamilton came to the convention instead of Jay. But there's politics being played all over. You know, politics doesn't change. We picture these people as, you know, superhuman, but they're all politicians. And they're manipulating, and they're planning. And James Madison from Virginia was a master at planning. He was a real true politician. Little frail guy, but a manipulator. So Sherman gets up and says, well, let's represent the states. Each state will be represented equally. 2 senators. Solved the problem. They were about to dissolve. They were fighting this thing so hard. And then, ever feel that the press doesn't tell the truth? Ever get that impression what I'm reading really isn't what's happening? We're all human beings. We don't change. this was going to be the nice thing about the Constitution. It's based on human nature. And we don't change, and neither does the press. The craziest incident happened when they took down the bell or the tower, where they had a big crown on it, on the cathedral or whatever you want to call it in Philadelphia, because it had been damaged by lightning. They took down the crown, the King's Church, I guess it was called, took it down to repair it. And somebody asked, well, what you going to do with it when he took it down? Well, we're going to fix it and put it back up. Aha. In the press, it spread out through the colonies that we are going to have a monarchy for a government, and they had the person picked out who was the second son of King George III, and he was in some duchy or whatever they want to call it in Germany. And he was going to come over and become our monarch. And that word got out. Now, I don't know if you're aware of it, but the rules and regulations in this convention, if you ever went to a convention, the first thing you start out with is the rules. The rules, when you're speaking, you will address the chair of the convention. No one will be reading, talking to somebody else, or shuffling around. You're going to be paying attention to what's being said. That's hard at a convention. 2, everything will be kept secret. No one will know what you're saying, so that you can speak your mind without any future repercussions. The other thing they did that was different, if a subject has been settled upon, you can recall it and discuss it again, which is interesting, because there are several places in that convention where delegates change their mind. Can you hear that happening today? If somebody changed their mind on an issue, oh my God, they'd be run out of office. But all of a sudden they realized, oh, this wasn't quite what we thought, in a debate and stuff. But the other thing they did, a couple of times they went into a committee of the whole. Now, why would they do that? That's an Anglo-Saxon approach of how do we solve this problem? We'll wear you out. Committee of the whole, you keep fighting the discussion and keep the discussion going until you finally come to an agreement. You wear each other out. That happened twice in this convention, where they had to keep themselves going until they could come to an agreement. Interesting, this is the way the procedure went. It ended up with all but 3 people willing to sign the final document. And the 3 that wouldn't sign it, the reason was very simple. It didn't have a Bill of Rights. Every state of the colonies, all 13 states now, independent states, had a Bill of Rights. The national government did not. It took us 2 years after it was implemented to get it. And it was implemented through the leadership of Madison. Why didn't they have a Bill of Rights? Well, if you read our Constitution, how many people have never read the Constitution or never looked at it? I'm amazed, because most people have never read it. It's unfortunate. It's quite a document. We the people, it starts out, we the people. That was a big issue back then. What do you mean, we the people? It should be we the states. And when that document went to the Committee of Style, that's how it read. We the state of New Hampshire, we the state of Massachusetts, we the state of, and went on from there. The man who wrote our Constitution and refined it was a man by the name of, I can't think of his name now, from Philadelphia, originally from New York. I can picture him. He's got one leg. He's a big guy, same size as Washington. Close my mind. I'm getting old. I feel like Ben Franklin. Anyway, he refined it. Morris, Gouverneur Morris. There was Gouverneur Morris and John Morris, or Robert Morris. They weren't related. Both of them multimillionaires by our standards. Both of them helped fund the Revolutionary War. I mentioned the fact that Jews couldn't vote. I don't know if I told you when Washington was at Valley Forge, couldn't pay his troops. John Morris and the Jewish fellow out of New York, very wealthy, funded George Washington's troops. Got an IOU, but never collected on it. When the Constitution was going in for its final draft, the Committee on Style, just prior to that, President Washington received a letter from one of his Jewish buddies, one or two of them that helped him out, saying, you know, it would really be nice if we as Jews would have the right to vote. So you read the first article of our Constitution, where you can't have a religious requirement for elected office. And they think that came from the advice Washington gave to Gouverneur Morris when he went in to write the final draft. Funny how little things can happen that cause a great wave. But this Constitution, they didn't think it was going to last that long. They wanted to be able to amend it, first of all, but there was a big push to change it after it was accepted. But what happened to the Constitution after they wrote it? It went out to the states. The states had to ratify it. And it took them over 2 years to do that. But the big cry was for Bill of Rights. And that we got those. But before I want to read something from Ben Franklin. You know, when a convention ended, what kind of government do we have? A republic if you can keep it. But they weren't sure if it was going to pass in the final vote. And, Ben Franklin wrote this and gave it to someone to read because he was not able to make it. But he wrote, every time he spoke, he wrote it out first. I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions, even on important subjects which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise. It is therefore that the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. Most men indeed, as well as most sects in religion, think themselves in possession of all truth, and that whatever others differ from them is so far in error. Steele, a Protestant, in a dedication tells the Pope that the only difference between our churches in their opinions is the certainty of their doctrines. The Church of Rome is infallible. The Church of England is never wrong. But though many private persons think almost as highly of their own infallibility as that of other sects, few express it so naturally as a certain French lady who in a dispute with her sister said, "I don't know how it happened, sister, but I meet with nobody but myself that's always in the right." In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults. If they are such because I think a general government necessary for us, and there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. And I believe further that this is likely to be a well-administered government for a course of years. And it can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. I doubt to whether of any other conventions we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interest, and their selfish views. From such an assembly, can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. And I think it will astonish our enemies, who are waiting with confidence to hear that our counsels are confounded like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation, only to meet hereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. The opinions I have had of its heirs I sacrifice to the public good. I have never whispered a syllabus of them abroad. Within these walls they were born, and here they shall die. If every one of us is returning to our constituents were to report the objections we had to it and endeavors to gain partisans in support of them, we might prevent its being generally received and thereby lose all salutary effect and great advantages resulting naturally in our favor among foreign nations, as well as among ourselves, from our real or apparent unanimity. Much of the strength and efficiency of any government is in procuring and securing happiness to the people depends on opinion and on the general opinion of the goodness of the government, as well as the wisdom and integrity of its governors. I hope, therefore, that for our own sake, as part of the people and for the sake of posterity, we shall act heartily and unanimously in recommending this Constitution, if approved by Congress and confirmed by the Convention, wherever our influence may extend, and turn our future thoughts, endeavors, to the means of having it well administered. Now you have to stop and think about this. The countries of Europe are waiting for us to fall apart. They were going to come in. Didn't happen. I think by the grace of God, we got through it. With all the human nature and all the fights that took place, we ended up with the greatest Constitution ever written. And I think you should thank God that you're blessed that we live in this environment, in this country. We have our problems, and every generation has. We went through our problems in 1800, in the dirtiest campaign that was ever fought in this country, between Adams, Jefferson, and Burr. And that's we had the election, through the process of representation from the ground up. We had changed the Constitution so that the vice president was elected separately from the president. At the time they counted the votes coming in, they had to have a majority, and you were the president. The second in line was the vice president. In 1800, Electoral College came in. Nobody had a majority. Burr, Adams was the highest, didn't have a majority. Jefferson and Burr. I think they had 30 rounds of vote. And what happens when that doesn't happen, it goes to the House of Representatives. They went 30 rounds of vote and couldn't agree on it. And finally, Hamilton, who was supporting Burr, backed out and supported Jefferson. And Jefferson won the election and won. And as great as Jefferson was, he was kind of a scoundrel. He undermined George Washington when he was Secretary of State. He tried to undermine Adams. He was a politician, but he's a good writer. But that's nothing's easy. And then they used to have this long bar on this triangle, and here was republic, over here was democracy. They called it mobocracy. It was a dirty word back then. And over here was aristocracy and the divine right of kings. And this pendulum swings like this. Our system is designed to handle that swing. It's designed so that it takes us 6 years to get through a process if we're going to make any major changes. We have the right to amend our Constitution. Is it a living document? It is, in that we can amend it. And George Washington, in his farewell address, said, don't jump off on the far end, basically. You have the right to amend. If you're going to make any changes, use the amendment route. Don't create laws that are not constitutional. If you get a chance, read George Washington's farewell address. If you get a chance, look at the Constitution. Wonder, how did it end up that way? What were the debates? What do we know about the background? What do we know about the philosophy? Because that's who we are. It didn't just happen. And I get excited when I'm reading about, especially in the biographies of the people that were at the convention and their whole background. It's an exciting period. But you know what? That excitement hasn't changed. We're in contact with that Constitution continuously. One little girl in the school who was campaigning for a candidate, she just was in high school, I think it was. They told her she couldn't do that. That case ended up in the Supreme Court. She had freedom of speech. We're all part of this process. So take a look at this Constitution. Take a look at our country and where is it going. Well, right now, the scale, as you lean over toward democracy, they got this chart. This is back in the 1700s. They got this chart where you have under democracy, you have a loss of property rights. You have a communal orientation and chaos and mob rule, not rule of law. We have a unique system. We have a rule of law. Supposed to. Over on this side, and they go back, and the founding fathers understood what happened in China. The poor emperor had built up a tremendous bureaucracy. They got so good they overthrew him. So on this side over here is bureaucracy. And that's kind of tipped us right now. In fact, we have political science writers now saying that we don't have a republic, we have an autocracy, because our bureaucracy has gotten greater than our legislative body. We have 150 organizations in our country right now, administrative system, that can make regulations. Regulation isn't law, but they can make regulations that impact your life in everyday life. We went through this emergency epidemic, and that was all ruled by, not by law, by regulation. The problem with regulation is they don't get the big picture. The legislator has to look at opposing views and options. A regulator doesn't have to do that. He can just create a regulation. Where's the review? That's the problem we face today. And then if you have politicians that politicize the agencies, That makes it very dangerous, like the FBI, CIA, and others. We have a constitution and certain things those agencies can't do, especially the CIA. We got around it today. We got a problem. You know, the CIA can't do any investigation of you. That's not their job. But if they want to get something on you, what they do, they go to England and say, hey, to their counterparts, we want to know about what they're doing. Would you check on it for us? So, you know, we're human beings. We get around the law, right? Any of you ever paid taxes and never paid more than they had to because you figured a way around the law? You know, we're humans. We have to be aware of that. But we have to be aware of the fact that our government is held in check by us. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense. Who's ever read that? The preamble. The preamble is a general. You can't claim like you provide for the general welfare or encourage the general welfare as a license to do anything you want in the name of welfare. Supreme Court ruled on that. They've tried that a couple times. But it lays out the basis of what our government is for, and it's for you. So do you have any questions? No questions? I talked too long.
Anyone here in the audience? Right here.
I had read that it didn't take long to write the Constitution. Wasn't it done in a very short period of time?
We started out May 12th, but then actually got together on the 25th of May. I think it was the 17th of September. It was over. But if you've ever been to a political convention, that's a long time. Every time they got into a point where there was totally impasse, they'd get a committee of 4 or 5 and say, okay, you take care of this. And they'd take a break for 4 or 5 days and come back. And that, even the Committee of Style, that's the final draft we have. And now we know from history and other writings after the Constitutional Convention that Gouverneur Morris basically, he not only reworded what he was working on, but he added a lot of things that weren't even brought up in the convention. So it's interesting how things happen in this country.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, Buford, you know the history very well of the Constitution. When you mentioned the fact that they were there for 3 months, from May until September, and they had a big deadlock over between the big states and the small states. Between the small states wanted equal representation, and the big states wanted representation by population.
Yeah.
And there was an impasse for 6 weeks, and it turned out to be they agreed to two bodies. It was the Sherman Compromise by Governor Sherman of Connecticut that broke the deadlock. Argument of 6 weeks was broken, and they agreed on the compromise of a Senate that had 2 senators for each state.
Yep.
equal representation in the Senate, and then a body of House members that represented populations. Wasn't this, some are arguing today that because of the Electoral College getting its combination of votes of 2 votes, every state plus the House members, that it represents a gift that never stops giving to the small states. And that's an item of controversy from those people that want to abolish the Electoral College. I'd like to have you comment on this argument of abolishing the Electoral College and going to a straight popular vote, which I am against.
That was debated at the convention. James Wilson from Pennsylvania was a real advocate of popular vote. When, you know, what kind of, we broke down into 3 sectors, the legislative, judicial, and the presidential. And it was Pinckney, the one that James Madison didn't like, got up and introduced a resolution that we have a single administrator called president. And James Wilson jumped in right away, seconded it, and he wanted it to be popular vote. And it's interesting, I just finished a book, 1776, or 1786, where it mentions what Wilson did, and they said if he lived today, he would be voting for a popular election. That's not true, because he was one of those who came around and said, hey, you're right, we don't want a direct election for the president, because when they looked at the people, the problem individuals have, you're easily led astray by a demagogue. Henry Patrick, for example, was a demagogue, but we needed his talent during the Revolutionary War. Give me liberty or give me death. He ends up the head of Virginia as a governor of Virginia, and then in the legislature, and he's out there catering to the individuals, doing away with their debt, you know, making it impossible to collect the debt. I mean, actually ruining his economy because he was catering to the people. He was a demagogue. And they knew there were people like him around because he was around at this time. And as one delegate said at a point, fortunately he died. And had Jefferson been at the convention, it might have been quite different because he was a, you know, populist. But no, they debated it. And like George Washington told Jefferson, when Jefferson was upset it wasn't a popular vote, he said, why do you pour your coffee in your saucer before you drink it? And Jefferson said, well, to cool it. He said, that's why we have an electoral college. We don't want a flim, last-minute demagogue swinging an election. We want some time in between so that some rational people can make a judgment. And some of those people that were supporting direct election did side with the electoral college concept. But it's a misunderstood. The idea is we're not supposed to have a democracy. We have a republic. Republics operate with people electing representation. And they were afraid of a democracy because that's mob rule. And you can swing somebody, or you can swing whole mobs. And ill-informed people can do dumb things. That's human nature. So, and the other thing, who should vote? That's a big issue, who should vote. Most of the people that could vote back then had to own property. Women couldn't vote. The only property women could own, I don't know if you know that during the slaveholding days, back in my day, the women could own slaves. Did you know that? Women could own slaves. The only thing they could own. The other thing that's interesting, the New England colonies had public education. And Massachusetts even educated women. But women didn't own property, couldn't own property other than slaves. So we've come a long way. I think we have anyway, but maybe some of you disagree with that. But I think given human conditions worldwide, we are the most blessed and most fortunate people in the world. And I really, if I'm looking at history and history of other countries, I'm just amazed at how well we've done. Do we have problems? We have some tremendous problems, but that's up to you, myself included. But I'm on the downside. It's up to you to take care of it. You've got to get involved. You have a say if you want to, but you have to know what we have. Take a look at our government. See if you like it. The state government in particular, this is the biggest problem we face in our country that really set us back. Which amendment was it, Steve, when the senators were popularly elected by the states rather than... Yeah, but what year was that? 13? 13, okay. The Senate was supposed to represent the interests of the state. And the interests of the states are much different than the popular election group. And they represented the interests of the states till 1913. And then it was opened up for the general election in the states. And at that point, the national government now didn't have to rely on states to do their job. All of a sudden, the national government started taking over a lot of the functions of the state in the name of politics. Because if I could get the government to do something for you, you're going to vote for me, right? And so what we're looking at now is that we're all sucking from the government. That's not the way it's supposed to be. When they talked about taxes back in the 1780s and 90s, you know what taxes were for? The operation of the government and national defense. You ever go into debt? No. You don't go into debt unless you go into war. Does that sound like our government today? Oh. No, that's because we have this whole group taking money out. What's the function of government? We become dependent on the government for a large part. When over half of us become dependent on the government, we've lost control. The government's supposed to ensure the welfare of the nation by helping ensure that we have a good economic environment, healthy place to work, decent working hours. I don't mind that with not the federal government, state government should do those things. But we have to look at the states. The other thing on the states that really bothers me, this last election. Who has the primary responsibility for election laws? You know? Who? Which legislature? The state legislative body has responsibility for the election laws. We had an emergency going on. What happened? The Secretary of State, who takes the orders from the legislative body, they have rules and procedures. They changed the procedures. No one said boo, so it's nothing wrong with it. They changed procedures. We had all those mail-out ballots, and we had all kinds of things happening that weren't tested or debated in the legislative body. How valid they were, I don't know. I'm hoping there wasn't any fraud in them. But even though the procedure changed without any, by executive order, no legislative action. Who said boo? Except for myself. I don't know who. I didn't hear anybody else that thought I was foolish. No, you got to understand it. What I really got upset with was the Trump administration. He wanted to run right away to the Supreme Court. They called election fraud. They went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's not going to take that. That's a state issue. Should have gone to the state courts. Should have gone to the states. But we had a president. He's never been in politics before. The first office he ever ran for was president. I don't know. His administrators should have known better. They should have been aware of what was going on. They weren't. So we have but even the election in 2016, they questioned it. So questioning elections is not new, except this was an extreme case. Maybe I'm getting out of line, but that's what I'm giving you my views. Oh, heavens, yes. Well, it depends who you're going to elect next election, what type of people we put into office, what the legislative body wants to do. Know who your House representative is going to be. So, make sure they take a look at the election laws in the state of Minnesota. I mean, the election laws are vitally important to us. Because if you don't have faith in the election laws, we don't have a system. And you got to have faith in the election laws. And that only comes from our state legislative body. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's, but it's all designed, our system is designed so you can flip it back and forth. It takes 6 years to do it. For checks and balances and the way the elections are set up. It was designed to prevent a big error screwing up the whole country forever. We can change it. We have an amendment process. We can change anything. Okay, that's it.
My thing is, I believe that's the activist judges who
Well, you have a couple problems of who's right and who's wrong. You have the fundamentalists, or the original intent. The problem you have with the original intent, and I like that approach, but the problem with it is the original intent of whom? The states were the ones that ratified the convention. So I don't know what the states intended. I know what the legislators or what the delegates intended. From my study, I think I do, but we're always finding something new because we don't know that much about the convention itself other than notes from Madison, and he was biased. But we're finding letters that were written to other people, and this is how we get our information of what happened at the convention. And there's a lot of that out. There's a lot of new books coming out. But what is the original intent? We're never really sure. So they say, well, what it actually says, the verbiage. So that's what they go back to. But what happens when there's a gap with it? It doesn't really address anything direct. We've had some, and you have those who use the legislative process, they abuse it by making legislators out of them. They want to overcome legislative action, so they go to the courts and try to get it turned over. And you have, judges are human. They all have their biases. It's scary sometimes. The only one on the court right now that I know is really what I'll call a originalist would be Clarence Thomas. And he goes back, but he's well versed in constitutional law. But he's being chastised continuously for his views. But he's an originalist. It's scary. We had the big issue in our country today as far as division is Roe versus Wade, the abortion issue. And I think it was Berger was Chief Justice when that was passed. He spent time down to Walter Reed. I know that. I talked to members from Walter Reed that told me about. He came down and said, when is human life viable? And it's interesting because their conclusion was similar to a 1838 conclusion, a Dred Scott decision, when they said, although blacks may be human, they're not persons under the protection of the law. And then they threw that out. And now, what was it? The woman justice that left and retired, went to Arizona. O'Connor, Senator Day, said this issue is in a collision course with biology. They're finding out more and more that the fetus is much more viable at a younger age. So it's on a collision course. We don't know how it's going to turn out. But it's a big issue it's a dividing issue in our country. But it came out of the Supreme Court. It didn't come out of a legislative body. Actually, from a constitutional point of view, that was a state issue. And this is the problem we face, is when the state lost their influence because of our senator being elected by the population. Used to be elected by the legislative body of the states. So, but the national government has grown ever since then. But then after World War II, I don't know, you people were around here, I grew up during the war. We did a fantastic job of mobilizing and winning that war. But our institutions, when the war ended, stayed in place. So I'm biased. I really believe that we have a military-industrial complex that kind of likes war. That's biased on my part, and I find it scary. But I just watch this in our defense spending. But that's a different issue. But we have some problems. But every generation has their problems. Every generation. The Constitution doesn't. The Constitution is there for us to handle it. I'm going to put it back on your lap because that's, okay. It's there. If we want to use it, fine. If we don't, we're going to do like Ben Franklin said in his letter. You know, it will last for a while as long as we have good management. And then it will end up with a tyrant. All governments come to an end. We just happen to have lasted longer than anybody else. But we'll stay in shape if we stay informed. The Constitution isn't worth the paper it's written on if it's not written into your hearts and minds. And I hope you remember that. I'm talking too long. I'll let you go.